So hello, welcome to class number 2 of Buddhist Psychology series. Welcome back. I hope that everybody had a wonderful week. Before we get into the discussion of today, just a little review, just a little reminder of what we talked about thus far last week. So last week we were having just the introduction of Abhidhamma, what it was historically. So the takeaway message that I'd like to just piggyback off of for this evening is, okay, so Abhidhamma is the third basket of Buddhist teachings in the Pali Canon. So we have the Vinaya Pitaka, which is the cluster of teachings around the monastic codes, the moral rules that the monastics needed to follow in order to harbor harmony within their community. Then there's the Sutta Pitaka, all of the teachings of the Buddha, thus have I heard, etc., etc. This Buddha is giving his sermon. And then Buddhist Psychology, the Abhidhamma Pitaka. So this is all of the teachings where the monks later on, a few centuries later, went through the suttas and kind of took out all of the teachings about the refined states of mind and subjective experience and organized them and systematized them. Yeah? So they were restructuring the Buddhist teachings on the experience of mind and body, and thus it became known as Buddhist psychology. So as I was stating earlier, as I was showing the books, we're going over the comprehensive manual of Abhidhamma. It's just lots of lists and sublists and such. So it can be a little, wow, this is like hardcore information. But you have to understand, it was compiled by deeply practiced monastics who had deep insight into the wisdom tradition. If we just are giving it a casual read, it might not land. Really, it might not have any kind of grab or catch to it. So I was stating to Swati earlier, this is an excellent introduction in more contemporary terms, original Buddhist psychology. Beth Jacobs, PhD, very good. She's putting it in very contemporary terms. Again, the spirit of Abhidhamma is analysis and synthesis. Yeah, so they're taking out kind of the teachings of Buddha talking to the householders about how to spend money, and Buddha talking to the monks about how to, certain things they shouldn't be doing. And it's really looking at all of the teachings that have this underlying sense of analysis and synthesis.
Can I ask you, when you talk about those two terms, even analysis versus synthesis, what are you actually meaning? I mean, analysis is breaking down and synthesis is putting together?
Again, excellent timing, Robert. So hopefully this will help. So analysis, again, so breaking down, yes. So the deconstruction of self, deconstruction of this egoic sense of self, deconstruction of this subjective experience of self and world, deconstruction of the mental phenomena. I'm sorry, what was that?
I'm sorry, I'm muttering to myself, thinking I was muted.
Oh, happens to all of us. So again, this analysis is not so much the Western analysis of lying on the couch and reflecting out loud to the analyst. It's an analysis of a deep meditation practice. Yeah? So when we can really refine the tools of the meditation practice to really look, turn the camera 180 degrees and look at what is this experience of mind and body, that degree of analysis and deconstructing of self. Yeah, so there are proper ways of introspection, as taught in Buddha Dharma, that separate it or make it distinct from, let's say, other traditions, other religions that may have, or other contemporary spiritual practices that may have different types of meditations or visualizations. So many of the Buddhist practices were geared towards, ultimately, the wisdom of being able to deconstruct this experience of self. Yeah. So then the synthesis, to your point of putting together, I guess synthesis meant here is more like the insight into conditionality, how one activity causes a resulting activity, and so on. Yeah. So because of A, B results, because of B, C results, because of C, D results. Yeah, so there's this wave of activity that is a result of a previous activity, but that activity is a causal factor for the next activity, and so on down the line. When I first heard that, I was like, yeah, okay, that's obvious, whatever. But really, it's a very foundational principle in Buddha Dharma. Because it ultimately goes down to this insight into there's no consistent, permanent, ongoing self or thing, so to speak. It's really looking at, rather than, let's see, our mind, our brain is designed to be able to distinguish, differentiate, make a sense of thing out of things. You know, this is glasses. That's all these are, glasses, until they break, and then they're broken glasses, and then they get thrown in the garbage, and then they're garbage, and then or recycling, and they're recycled. But the insight practice allows us to be able to kind of like shift something that takes place in our brain so that we can have the potential for a more allocentric experience of self, rather than this is a me abutting up against other things and having this kind of billiard balls ricocheting off of each other experience of the world. There could become the potential for more of an allocentric integrative experience. And this is one of the things that deep insight can lead us towards. So all activities existing in present form are results of previous conditions, themselves creating conditions for future results. Why that's important is the more that we can, through analysis, be able to see that, how I'm showing up in this moment and relating to my sensory activity inclines me towards, well, am I going to increase more suffering and clinging? Or does that incline me towards the release of suffering and opening up more towards liberation? Yeah, and through that ability to discern the subjective experience in this way, and have that ability to relate differently to our sensory experience, it can produce a vastly different experience of self in the next moment. So analysis and synthesis is the spirit of the law here. Again, a little editorial commentary. I might have mentioned this last week, but sometimes when people have kind of like read through Abhidhamma, they're just like, yeah, whatever, that's odd. I don't quite get it. In a community that I was previously affiliated with, a lot of the members there were very anti-Abhidhamma. And that's understandable. It's not everybody's cup of tea. But there can be a danger of, and this is what I was seeing taking place within that particular community, there's a danger in only a scholarly understanding of the Dharma without having a meditation practice or a wisdom tradition practice that is of the same caliber and intensity. Yeah. So if we neglect or deprioritize having the direct experience of the meditation and we favor the scholarly aspect of it, there's a particular danger of that, which is, well, orthodoxy, or how shall we say, individuals who deeply cling to the letter of the law while completely missing the spirit of the law. And this is something that I've seen time and time again. It's one of the bugs, I think, in the early Buddhist tradition. All the different schools, I embrace all the different schools of Buddhism as all having their own strengths and weaknesses. And I think one of the weaknesses ultimately of Theravadan Buddhism and early Buddhism is people eventually began to prioritize the practice and direct experience and go more towards the scholarly understanding through reading and literature. And with that intellectual concept and completely denying themselves the deep wisdom that arises, well, they can go into some deep misinterpretations. So much so that within the Zen tradition, in a lot of their Zen anecdotes, they have, there's the well-known figure of the, master, et cetera, was walking down the road, and they came across the Sutta master. And the Sutta master is supposed to be like a Theravadan, scholar, And they're usually represented as the Elmer Fuds of the Dharma, somebody that's just like completely misses the point and doesn't understand it. So I think that this is something that really is important to understand, that, practice, let's practice. So yes, it would be great to read, and it would be great to maybe look at some of these books that I mentioned, but whatever time that you spend towards reading, maybe if you replace it with or match it with cushion time, where you're actually practicing the meditation, maybe that we've engaged with during this class, I think that might be of equal, if not more value, because ultimately, having the direct experience and then having a sense of, oh, okay, now that experience has some context, then it might make sense. Because if we're looking first for the intellectual part of our mind to make sense out of something that's as of yet outside of our experience, then we can form a definition and then cling to it. So then ultimately, when the experience shows itself, we kind of dismiss it. Like, that's weird. That doesn't match my belief system. And then we get rid of it. So anyway, so that's just a little editorial commentary on, I think, the importance of having a dedicated meditation practice here. Okay, so let's get into more things. So let's see. Again, before going into just like lots of terms and definitions and lists and such, I want to backtrack a little bit and really see how this spirit of kind of deconstruction exists in the Dharma. And I'm sure a lot of us have heard the term of the Eightfold Path. And there's a particular structure of teaching the Eightfold Path that I'd like to reflect upon here. And it really talks about the practice of Buddha Dharma as a progressive path, as an evolutionary path. So I want to, bring your attention to this little odd figure here, this little three-tiered structure. It's supposed to be a stupa. So a stupa is something that you will see in a lot of Buddhist countries, or countries that had Buddhism as its main, or one of its main religions or at some point in its history. And their structures, they could be small, they could be vastly huge, but they usually have this basic three-layered structure to them. And they're essentially a teaching tool. And they represent three essential categories of teachings here, the Eightfold Path. So when we build a house, we don't start with the chimney, we don't start with the roof, we start with the foundation. So these are the teachings on ethics, morality. Sometimes the term sila is interpreted as integrity. Yeah, so this is the lessons on practicing right speech, right action, right livelihood. Yeah, so if we want to cultivate ourselves in a particular way, if we want to decrease our sense of suffering, if we want to increase our sense of well-being in the world, well, yeah, let's look at what we're generating. Let's look at the action we're generating, the karma we're generating, the types of actions that I'm engaging in. Are they prone to ill will? Are they prone to greed? Are they prone to covetousness? Yeah, or are they prone to generosity and kindness, compassion? Yeah? And the same thing. Maybe we can stop being violent or being compulsive and what have you, but maybe we might see how some of those intentions and some of those things start to leak out in our speech as well. So there's this this activity of renunciation. What are some of these impure or unwholesome impulses that show up in our speech and action? How can we renounce them? Yeah? And conversely, how can we cultivate more skillful qualities and intentions that underlie our speech and action? And as well, livelihood is a very important thing to take into consideration, being that unless one is independently wealthy, the majority of our waking hours are spent searching for a dollar. So what's happening during that livelihood? What is our job asking us to cultivate? Doing when we show up to work, are we being, is the job itself creating ill will in the world? Is the job itself unethical? There's something to consider there, how that influences not only the world, but your own sense of self. And let's just say conversely that maybe your job is not unethical, maybe it's ethical or neutral, but what are you cultivating inside of your mind and heart as you go through the day? Is there a way in which you're showing up at your job that you're overly stressed, um, overly anxious, overly resentful, maybe of coworkers? So maybe I'm just pushing paper and trying to get the job done, but constantly having my eye on the clock, meeting the deadline. I'm background cultivating a ton of anxiety. So the livelihood becomes really a place of practice or unconscious practice. So this is something to take into consideration. The place we show up every day, what is it making us cultivate in terms of ourselves? And that's oftentimes something that doesn't shut off. Yeah, our job calls certain aspects of our personality to the forefront. So the teachings on ethics. Let's watch our action, our speech, and livelihood. So why it's progressive is, well, as I'm kind of becoming aware of, oh, I want to say this, maybe that's not the right thing. Maybe I want to do this, oh, but I'm not going to do it. I'm going to sit with that feeling. Well, that just kind of moves us up to this next tier, so to speak, samadhi. We can use the term meditation for it. But the path factors for this tier of the Eightfold Path: concentration, mindfulness, and effort. So concentration, literally, when you look at the path factors, it says, first jhana, second jhana, third, and fourth jhana is right concentration. But really, how is it that we can cultivate the mind so that we can put it upon an object we deem relevant for as long as we deem it relevant, to the exclusion of what's irrelevant? If we are attempting to cultivate a good intention of generosity, of goodwill, of kindness, well, can we focus on that and breathe some life into that? Yeah. And, if we're attempting to cultivate just the skill set of concentration itself, how is it that we can spend time to devote those qualities of mind? Yeah. And then the concentration, how can we direct that towards mindfulness? How can we direct that towards our own introspection? Now, then, traditionally, mindfulness is taught of as mindfulness of the body, mindfulness of feeling tone, mindfulness of mind, and the Dhammas. Yeah. And so it's this progressive refining of what it is that we're looking at in our subjective experience. So as we're applying concentration to our own meditation on what makes up this experience of self, we can see how when we're feeling averse to it or craving, how that creates more suffering. But if we can let go of that and lean towards equanimity and kindness, how that produces more skillful states. Well, great. Keep doing that. That's the right effort. The right effort is to know, just to kind of take an assessment. Right now my mind is feeling a little sluggish. Well, the right effort says, how can we um, increase our energy? Yeah, I'm noticing my mind is a bit aversive right now. Well, how's that we can let go of the aversion and turn towards cultivating mental factors of equanimity, kindness, appreciative joy. Yeah, so the sense of how can we continue to drop the unskillful inclinations of mind and lead towards the skillful inclinations. So once these three co-occurring, being practiced together, take on a critical mass, it begins to change things on an even more refined level, where we can really rest in the sense of what our intention is. In each given moment, we can see this sense of intention. Oh, okay, yes, I'm seeing the intention of goodwill arise. I'm seeing the intention of unskillfulness and unwholesomeness arise. And I know how to relate to it. Yeah. And then ultimately, this sense of self-view. So right view. So a lot of these path factors are right concentration, right speech, right action. And the idea isn't like right versus wrong, is good or bad, heaven, hell. But in terms of really, the metaphor of the path, if we're going from point A to point B, point A being a suffering, confused, untrained self, to point B, which is an awakened, deeply liberated self, well, there's a particular path, how to go in that direction. So just saying the right before things, something is right versus wrong, is really what direction are you going on the path? So right view means, well, in contrast, wrong view. Wrong view is I am this independent self out in the world, and these horrible things are happening to me. And why does it always happen to me? And here I am, a victim. And now I'm going to just get into some self-indulgent storytelling on that. And that's going to perpetuate this feeling of resentment and anguish for the next 45 minutes to 45 days. Yeah, that's a way in which there's a view of self that's clinging to suffering. Versus right view, we begin to gain insight into, well, dukkha occurs. Yeah? Gain insight into the Four Noble Truths. Dukkha occurs in each moment. There's a suffering or a sense of discontent, a sense of lack. The more that we can be refined about noticing how it arises in the various sense gates, we can see its origination. Oh, I'm seeing clearly. It's originating in this sense gate. I'm having this particular image arising in the seeing space of the mind. And then, boom, that's becoming the fuel for an emotional reaction of pain, anguish, longing in the heart, in the body. Now, the more that I can just hang out with that with sufficient equanimity and understanding, then I can notice how those sensations can pass away. And then as I'm noticing them pass away, I'm no longer identified with them. My identity of self is peeling off, and I'm gaining this objectivity or not self. Yeah. Now then, as long as we can do that, fourth noble truth is the Eightfold Path. So it directs us back to this. Well, how can we do that here, here, and here, and all these different levels? So there's this kind of fractal continuing to augur deeper, deeper into the practice. So I just want to talk a little bit about that sense of, um, of there's a progressive nature to the path that asks us to become ever more inclined to see this experience of self on a more refined level. So that's starting to kind of put us a little bit more in the direction of Abhidhamma, in terms of analysis of self and seeing the conditionality, seeing how the suffering arises. So even in the spirit of the Four Noble Truths, we can see that what we're being asked to do in the Abhidhamma. Yeah? Any questions on any of that thus far? Okay, moving right along. Let's go back to it. Okay, so then, in the spirit of that, the three training models, okay, so it's an evolutionary practice. I mentioned about mindfulness. I mentioned about right concentration. But there are four basic or foundational meditation practices in early Buddhism that are most frequently mentioned by the Buddha. We have the Metta practices of loving kindness, the Brahma Viharas. We have the Samatha practices, or cultivating a calm abiding. And those calm abiding practices of shamatha leads us potentially into jhana, or deeper states of concentration. And then, of course, we have the vipassana practices, or insight practice, that gives us insight into the nature of dukkha, anicca, anatta. So the sense of how the discontent arises, how there can be that sensory fluidity or impermanence that occurs. And really, if we were to look at it in terms of directives, the more that we can tap into that fluidity of our sensory experience, the sense of our suffering self begins to peel away from the discontent. We can gain this not self or no self that can occur. Yeah. So I'll talk a little bit more next week. I know that last week there was a certain percentage of individuals who were saying that they're interested in being that they're clinicians, they're interested in some clinical applications of this. So I'll go a little bit more into that next week. But I want to lay the groundwork of a little bit of some Buddhist terminology. Ultimately, wisdom practices, deeper insight, deeper emptiness. More to come on that later. So, as mentioned from the Beth Jacobs book, I thought that she had a great way of talking about this term citta. So citta, for those who might be familiar with the four foundations of mindfulness, there's the body, kayana anupassana, I'm going more through the anapanasati system, kayana anupassati, tracking of the mind, vedana anupassana, or tracking of the feel tone, then citta anupassana, tracking of the mind. So I like the anupassana because it talks about tracking, talking about the different foundations of mindfulness, not as objects and things, but so much more so as activity. So really what we're going to ultimately be looking at is there's this ongoing activity that's constantly stitching together this experience of self and world in each moment. So this term that we will see quite often in Abhidhamma, Citta. So the way that a nice little mnemonic that Beth Jacobs comes up with is consciousness in transit, touching anything. Yeah, so that's a basic way of looking at it. Yeah, so it's the smallest unit of consciousness, of knowing, of perception, acts of consciousness moving and connecting phenomena. It presupposes the mental factors. Mental factors will be kind of like more mental states that we can get into. But it's really kind of like this, atomical activity of mind. Yeah. Here the quote from her. Citta is experienced as a sense of continuity of process, a general coherence in the world that we don't notice because it's arising at every instant. The momentary mental state of knowing in the world strings together experiences like the process of animation. We think awareness is constant, but it is actually a series of microscopic moments of knowing objects of the perceived and constructed world. So, she lists that it could mean there's the action of consciousness, so anytime attention shifts from one object to another, object meaning I'm looking at this light, now I'm looking at the books on the other side of the room, now I am aware of myself sitting here, now I'm aware of the screen, that's all citta. There's the activity of the mind that's moving towards these different objects, things I'm contacting. So it's the action of consciousness, the light shining upon things. Oh, I'm aware I'm contacting the light. I'm aware that see space, I'm contacting the books, etc. There's the initial basic touch of consciousness on any object, just the overall dynamic activity that takes place. So this term citta is a nice way to start to enter into some of the basic terminology there within Abhidhamma. So why is that important, that term? So, to use the quote from Socrates, to know thyself is the beginning of wisdom. So on what level? We can have the interpersonal psychological level of, yes, that's important to know. What are our drives and motivations? What are our early experiences that make us show up how we do now? So on that Western sense, that Western psychology sense, it's we need to know and understand ourselves. That's the beginning of that type of wisdom. But to know ourselves on this kind of microscopic level, where we can really drop out moment by moment, be able to pull out of this egoic sense of self. That is to say, can we drop our story? Can we pull out of the experience of I am me in the context of this narrative? These are things happening to me. These are things I want. These are things I want to do. That sense of yourself in a narrative, drop out of that and drop into your experience of self as a sensory system. Moment by moment, what is our nervous system activation? If we can pay attention to our faculty of attention and notice where it's pulled towards moment by moment, and how our attention is pulled towards something, how it connects with it, and how that might create the conditions for the next uprising. I see something over across the road, and then now that triggers an image arising in the mind of a particular memory when I was 6 years old, which is now creating the conditions for a particular uprising of emotion within the body that is now triggering an internal talk commentary on, and so on and so on. To be able to see that flow of activity, we can gain insights into some kind of maybe more unconscious patterns and inclinations towards gripping, grasping. And we may begin to have a sense of how to intervene upon those experiences at a very early, almost pre-conscious processing level. So to know the uprising of one's subjective experience moment by moment in a way that we can perceive how this continuity of self and world occurs, contacting the moment by moment movement of mind in all its different ways, we can start to discover some rather interesting things about ourselves. Okay, so going back to it, or actually, maybe not. Again,
question?
Yeah, absolutely. Question, please.
So you're essentially talking about it's like the fight or flight response, right? Which can happen on like a very subconscious level, and we're creating the conditions that can cause that. And I guess I had a question this morning that kind of relates to that in my other meditation class, but once you start realizing it and you're there, right? Because like a couple months ago, I realized, well, I healed my anxiety on my logical, rational brain, but it's still happening on a subconscious nervous level to where I'm waking up in fight or flight with like rapid heartbeat, right? So like I know that, and I'm feeling it, and I'm in touch with it, and it's fading with time. But like, I guess I'm just wondering, like, if you have those triggers, what do you do once you recognize them? What do you do? Like, where do
Once
you go?
recognize the trigger. Can you give me a specific example? You were talking about waking up with a sense of a fight or flight. What's the?
Yeah, well, I mean, just say like you have a really stressful day, and then, or let me just talk first. I have a really stressful day, and then I go to bed, and then I'm waking up repeatedly, immediately, rapid heartbeat, fight or flight, right? And I'm not freaked out about anything from a logical, rational brain. It's literally a sympathetic nervous system response.
Yes.
And I'm aware of it now because of the work that I've been doing to become more in touch with my body, right? So like I'm just at this place now where it's like I'm noticing it and I'm sitting with it, and I get like this self-compassion stuff. But my question this morning was like, how do you shield yourself, like, or prepare yourself to go into like situations where you know you're going to be triggered? But yeah, I guess I don't know where I'm going with this, but
Sure. Well, I mean, if I can very simplify it, is how do I get rid of it in a way? How do I can not have that particular flavor of suffering?
yeah, how do I not cause my sympathetic nervous system to like freak out?
Yeah,
You know, like,
absolutely. Yeah. So again, so I was talking about like that list of different practices. We have the Metta, Shamatha, Jhana, Vipassana. And I go back to this adage that we say they're meditations, but back in the day of the Buddha, there was no word for meditation. The term he would use was bhavana, which meant cultivation or training. So in a way, it would be lovely if there was a quicker fix, especially if we're talking about suffering, really on that level of suffering. You're talking about this fight or flight activation that's happening, you're waking up with, or going out into the world, and there's that trigger that triggers so deeply. I'm sorry that's the case, and I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that, especially even if they didn't have a condition before. I'm sure 2020 has given all of us that condition for sure. So there's a way that we can train for that. I'll talk a little bit about this next week, but the different meditation practices, old school ones, have particular ways that can really protect us. Yeah. So you were talking about kind of sitting with it, having the mindful self-compassion and such. But the way that I like to train is, well, the shamatha practices, that brings the cooling effect. So what that does is that really spotlights that sense of urgency that we have. So, and how is it that we can gain control of contacting our experience and just kind of taking that sense of urgency out? Yeah. So when there's a problem, it's like, oh my God, there's a problem. I can't rest until we deal with the problem. There's that urgency that's there. And when you're talking about a fight or flight response, that's all urgency, right? It's just, a code orange, code red is happening. So the more that we can train ourselves within the shamatha practices, that's the tool of, well, deep self-regulation that can occur. So that's the part of the pragmatism of the shamatha practices in terms of dealing in this world. Then, of course, you were talking about the mindful self-compassion, the metta practices. How is it that we can maybe shift our attention away from some of the negative experiences and be able to cultivate some of the more positive, loving experiences, or rather than tighten up and turn away, how can we open up towards, with kindness, having compassion towards this pain, having appreciation for other experiences. So, for a lot of us who have anxiety, histories of anxiety, if we really look what's going on, there might be a whole bouquet of different types of flowers going on. But historically, we always say, okay, but anxiety, you get to the front of the line. We're always giving precedence to maybe anxiety in this case. So there's a deep pattern there. So how is it that we can literally shift our attention from this thing that's really loud to maybe this more subtle thing here, and in our attention in there, begin to kind of like grow and emphasize that, so that becomes a stronger reaction, and this response becomes less of something that wants to push to the front of the line. So that's part of the utility of the metta practices. Of course, the insight practices would be, okay, that anxiety can show up, but how can I not necessarily identify with it? It's like, well, okay, it's happening, but it's not really me. It's not really the seat of my identification of self. So it can become something that becomes just a tone that's in the background. So that's more of like this metta awareness piece that happens. So the more that we can cultivate the shamatha, the metta, and the vipassana together, it allows us to, here's this anxiety that's arising. And just by opening up and turning towards, they can kind of, there's this unified experience of being able to take the urgency out of it, have a complete experience of it, so I'm no longer identified with it, and able to replace it with more of kind of a loving, compassionate response. Now then, again, that's a training that happens. So just like we're training for, a race, or we're training for, some large activity, it requires some daily consistent effort. Now, I guess that goes back to when I was earlier saying, well, what's better, the reading or the practicing? The mind can understand something, but really when we're talking about, the goals of Buddha Dharma, as far as early Buddhism, in terms of suffering and the cessation of suffering, it's this deeper nervous system that really needs to learn. And that's really the school of learning for the nervous system, is the meditation practice. So I wish that I could have like a silver bullet of, do this and it'll take care of it, which, it will take time and effective ways of working with it. So I don't know what your meditation practice looks like currently, but the more that maybe you can emphasize those three particular flavors of the shamatha, all right, I know how to cool things down, take the urgency out. The vipassana, all right, I know how to break my identification of I am with it. Then the metta, I can increase this baseline experience of, kindness, compassion, appreciative joy, etc. That really makes this human experience all the more livable, even when the world is constantly trying to throw all sorts of things at us. I hope that's relevant. I don't know if hopefully it is. Okay, good. Thank you, Jennifer. Okay. So were you about to ask a question? Anybody have any other questions before we go into a practice? Yeah, go ahead, Lindsay.
Yeah, no, I just, as a follow-up to that, I think I understand what like a Vipassana meditation and metta meditation and like Jhana meditation, but actually I'm like thinking when you say meditation that's shamatha, that's like cooling, like you kind of give more of an example of what that would look like.
Sure. So let's see. When I often guide meditations, I start off with a breath-based focus, and I consider that kind of like a shamatha, in terms of, can I notice the calming, relaxing, pleasant attributes of an object? Yeah. So really, whatever it is we're looking at can be different types of meditations. If I'm looking at my breath and I'm trying to discern what is the experience of dukkha within that and have this sense of disidentification from it, that's a vipassana meditation. But if I'm looking at the breath and I'm saying, what is calming about this? What is the available thing that is just a little balancing in this experience? Oh, I noticed that. It might be really tiny, but I noticed that and I can appreciate that, which can create another upwelling of an experience of calm or balancing, which then can, the more I notice it, the more it promotes it, and the mind begins to simplify and settle. So oftentimes when we sit to meditate, and like you said, Lindsay, you know the difference between A, B, and C, but oftentimes when we go to sit, regardless of the meditation, usually the first few minutes or first chunk of the meditation, really a shamatha effect is going on because the mind is all over the place and it's just, slowly beginning to like calm down and settle a little bit. So that process of calming down and settling and the mind able to sit and focus, that's the shamatha quality of mind taking place. So that shamatha quality can happen in metta, it can happen in the vipassana. But so a lot of times the way that I like to work with it is by deliberately trying to look for the qualities that are pleasant within our experience. And that tends to promote them. And overall, the side effect of that is it produces this settling. To go into it, there's the quality, there's the mental factor of ekaggata. Sometimes it's referred to as single point focus. That's one of the usages of it. But ekaggata is really the quality, the mental factor of mind that brings a sense of balance and coordination of all of our experiences. Yeah. So a monk friend of mine, Dhammananda, the way that he talks about it is ekaggata is like gravity in the solar system. Without gravity, all the planets are just, they're going willy-nilly. But you take the gravitational pull at the center of the sun, all the planets kind of find their place and they're doing their activity in perfect harmony with each other. And everything is balanced and coordinated. So whenever we have that experience of balance and coordination happening within our mind, that's the ekaggata factor. When we're on freak out, so in contrast, Jennifer, you're talking about the limbic system overdrive that happens. Ekaggata does not exist. It's just like that factor is taken out. So like all the mental factors are kind of going and not relating to each other in a way that's constructive or harmonious. And it's just like the experience of self is rather chaotic. So the shamatha qualities, really any of those meditations that begin to bring this balancing factor, that's promoting the ekaggata quality of the mental factor of ekaggata in the mind that balances and coordinates. So, we're about to jump into a sit, and I'll distinctly point out really what the shamatha is, and hopefully that'll ground it a little bit more. Yeah. All right. Okay, everybody, you're all super awesome. Thank you for these making it real questions. Allow yourself to get into a comfortable upright position. Allow yourself to straighten up and settle in. Taking a moment to settle into posture. When you find a place that is of relative comfort, get in touch with an intention to maintain stillness. And in the process of settling in, can we settle into this faculty of awareness itself? Whatever that quality of brightness, aliveness is in the mind or body, can we rest into that as the seat of our practice? Okay, so before we get into the exercise, let's spend a few minutes of shamatha cultivation. as we turn our attention towards the breath. So if you can anchor your attention onto a part of the body that's directly involved with the breathing process, be that the nose, throat, lungs, or belly, just anchor attention somewhere there. Noticing not merely the entering and exiting of air, but distinctly the shamatha practice. What is pleasant? What are the pleasant qualities of breath? On the in-breath, is there a pleasant energy, maybe even a joyful feeling, or oxygen needs being met by breathing in? Can you notice that? Give yourself permission to feel that. The top of the in-breath, as we're breathing in and it naturally goes to pause before breathing out. What's uniquely pleasant there? A particular wakeful quality, a pleasant fullness. Just notice what is available at the top of the in-breath. Give yourself permission to feel that. And on that out breath, what are the pleasant qualities available there? An innate relaxation response, restfulness, or relinquishing. Discern what is present. Give yourself permission to feel that. And the base of the out breath. Settledness, a peacefulness, a contentment. What's authentically there for you? Notice and feel. Doesn't hurt to put a subtle smile on the face as well, reminding us to smile inwardly at ourselves. So the first half of the breath tends to have a gladdening effect on this mind and body. The second half of the breath tends to have a balancing effect on the mind and body. Use whatever pleasant qualities there are. They may be subtle, they may be fleeting, that's fine. To whatever degree you can notice and attune to them while they're there. Meet them with an appreciation. So to whatever degree you may notice the mind, body settling. That's the shamatha component. To whatever degree things may begin to simplify, have a sense of balance. That's the ekaggata mental factor. Okay, good. So knowing that breath is always there, breath is always available. Feel free to return to it at any point or bring it with you as we move into these next steps of the exercise. So for some, this may be effortful, but just consider it an experiment. Allow yourself to be open to it. It's an exploration here, to the best of your ability. In terms of success, just shoot for a D minus, really. Just allow yourself to just be open and experiment with it. So the direction is just see. That is to say, can you bring your attention to this faculty of seeing? So that can be the experience of the mind's eye projecting images of fantasy, planning, daydream upon a mental picture plane. From moment to moment, images may arise associated with thought. And from moment to moment, there ain't nothing happening, but you're just looking at the backs of your eyelids. So just bring your awareness to this sense gate of seeing and attempt to hold your attention here. So according to Abhidhamma, this observing this particular seeing activity, this is the sense door. The sense object is whatever it is that we are seeing, whether it's the activity of images associated with thought, or the sense object is just a sense of rest in the seeing space. Ain't nothing happening but darkness or brightness. Then within this, there can also be the sense consciousness. If we see back, there's this awareness that occurs before it individuates into wanting to see. What is it that is looking? So I'm just sensitizing us to different facets of this overall sense gate of seeing. And if you notice, moment by moment, this citta taking place, the activity. Moment by moment, are you more aware of the sense object, what you're seeing? Then does the next moment, does Citta contact more like the sense of awareness? The next moment, does it space out, fall into thinking? Next moment, Citta is back contacting sense gate of sea space. Consciousness in transit touching anything, as we're just free floating in sea space. Okay, good. So we were playing around, simple contact with sea. Now let go of that. And bring your attention to this sense domain of hearing. So, what is it that we are hearing? It can be the internal talk, the internal thinking that is auditory, the conversations, the commentary. That's activity of hearing in. Moment by moment, there can be this activity of hearing outward to sounds in your environment. Or from moment to moment, we might be aware primarily of the quietness in between the ears, the restfulness in between the ears, nothing happening. Whether it's inside or outside, active or restful, that would be the sense object of hearing. From time to time, our attention may pull back into just hearing consciousness. What is this faculty of awareness that wants to hear? What is it that's making contact with the sound or the internal talk? So working within the sense domain of hearing, the citta is the activity that's constantly bopping back and forth. Hearing out into sound, hearing in into internal talk, noticing rest, noticing the consciousness that hears. All these little micro moments that occur in the simple activity of hearing. And also, as we are contacting any of these little micro moments, how are we responding? All of this sensory input, can it become frenetic? Do we notice how we're responding? We bring a sense of acceptance, a sense of equanimity to whatever we're contacting. That tends to help bring that shamatha, bring that metta response towards whatever arises. Okay, good. So let go of that, just come into the body. And actually, if you want, we can come back to the breath, particular facet of the body, just as we began. There can be the feel out experience or the more pressure on pressure experience of breath, just the mechanical entering and exiting of air. There can be the feel in experience or the more emotive response. What are the qualities breath is bringing? Joyfulness, wakefulness, relaxation, peace. What is this awareness that wants to feel within the body, the sense of brightness, aliveness within the body? So the citta is bopping back and forth in these micro moments, just stitching together this continuity of our experience of breath in the body. And with each piece of sensory information that arises, if we can consciously greet that with a sense of acceptance, kindness, equanimity, does that help increase the sensory clarity as well as increasing the shamatha, calm abiding within? before I ring the bell, don't take the bell as an invitation to stop meditating, but take the bell as an invitation to merely open the eyes and continue to remember what you're doing. Taking a moment to just make a mental snapshot, to notice what is working for you right now. And whatever piece of that, take that with you to this next phase of practice. Okay, so post-bell practice, eyes open, allowing yourself to continue to receive the merits of your efforts. So what did you notice? What did you observe? What was relevant for you for that practice period? Feel free to just unmute yourself and manifest.
When I was doing the seeing, I was very tempted to open my eyes and see not just the mental images, but also actually the sense door of vision.
That would have been perfectly
I think
okay.
that's okay too, yeah, right.
Yeah. Actually, I probably in hindsight, I could have mentioned that as an option as well. But yeah, sometimes with that focusing outward, where we're taking as the object of focus, the external visual plane, the external hearing, and the external tactile sensations, that becomes something when we become adept at it, we can take that off the cushion and that can become an abiding practice in motion, for sure. Good, Swati. Anybody else? What did you notice? What did you observe? What was relevant for you?
Mike, I was wondering at some point during the seeing and the hearing part, you say something, I don't remember the exact words, but to just understand or take in the facility of seeing or hearing. I don't remember how you said it, but I wasn't really sure what you meant. You know what it's more a kind of a meta, I don't mean meta, like, like a overview of the hearing or seeing or something like that, but what?
A 1T metta.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, the faculty of awareness that wants to see. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, I know there's no real tangible thing that we can point to. It's a subtle sense. So within Abhidhamma, it's just like, all right, these are there's the sense domain of seeing. There's the sense object of what's being seen. And then there's the sense consciousness. What is seeing? And within that is making contact. There's the sense consciousness, making contact with the sense object. And so it's like, and then the Citta is kind of exploring all of that. What's it like to see this thing happening? Oh, sometimes I'm just aware of just the activity of seeing, or maybe sometimes there's this deeper, subtler sense of awareness itself that is actually doing it. So right now, as you're looking at the screen, the object would be the screen, but with keeping your eyes open, if you could pull your attention back into here, notice just the activity of seeing. And
what's confusing to me about that is that can become self.
Sure can.
Which is, we're trying to kind of skip around the sense of self. So I was confused in that moment, but it was a little kind of interesting confusion.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting confusion. I think is probably an ideal place to be in many ways. Yeah. But yeah, so to that point of like, oh, let's pull back into that awareness, and you're like, well, that's kind of gives me a sense of self. Yeah, then that becomes a bit more of a self-inquiry practice, because how, moment by moment, how is it that you're experiencing self? This is how you're experiencing the self arising within this particular sensecate, so to speak.
Right, it's kind of why you experience self, because you kind of, I'm the one who's seeing.
Mm.
Well, and okay.
And if you
And
continue,
it's almost, so is it for the almost the purpose of noticing how self arises from the sense of sense, from this sense self? Um,
any of these things is subject to clinging, and we can make a self out of any of it.
mm-hmm.
So if you sustain contact with that awareness quality, sometimes there could be a sense of I am within that, and sometimes that sense of I am can fall away, and there's just an awareness without identity, so to speak. Yeah. So
I can actually, I had it, even as you were speaking, I can kind of pull back a little bit
good.
and get a sense of, I can fluctuate between a sense of self and a sense of, well, maybe it's just seeing with not connected to, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Excellent. Keep doing that for sure. Good. Thank you, Robert.
Hopping on to that was the that moment for me in the guided was the moment of self-inquiry where awareness itself arose.
Mm-hmm.
So that what is seeing, what is feeling, what is knowing, that presence became available. So it's not self. In a way, I think Robert was constructing that. It's that inquiry where all of a sudden everything stops and there's only awareness. I don't know if there's words for that, but
yeah.
So that was really a nice moment.
Good. I like the usage of the word presence, because that can really suggest kind of the awareness kind of really without really like an I am or an ego structure to it. But there's definitely like a presence that's there for sure. Yeah. Great. Thank you for that, Kinch. Okay, good. So anybody find that very effortful and a little laborious? For many people, if they're newer to these practices, that could be an effortful one, because we're really narrowing the focus to one sense domain and just kind of trying to maintain our contact with a very narrow facet of our experience. But even within that, it kind of opens up into, wow, there can be a lot happening here. So the main thing is noticing, well, what is happening and how are we responding to it? Is there some kind of clinging that's happening and then we're kind of making an I out of it? Or even beyond that, is there some sort of clinging to it? There's this subtle aversion towards it, want to push it away, and then an I forms in it, a personality view forms in it. Or there's something else happens over there and it's like, oh, some craving forms in reaction. I want to drop my experience and go after that fantasy daydream. So how is it that we're responding? So going back to the shamatha piece, and I think I might have said that at some point towards the end there, we can notice the sensory clarity of what's taking place at this very kind of like subatomic level. But then also it's just like, if we're meeting it with that equanimity, that full acceptance, that has the qualities of shamatha of like, oh, I can rest into that. Yeah. It has the qualities of metta of like, oh, it's actually creating this kind of like wholesome, skillful, kind of life-affirming response to it, regardless if it's pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, so to speak. So just the noticing the facet of the experience and how we're responding, and slowly that we can choose this response on this very, very subtle level. That's something that we really want to work on and begin to cultivate for sure. Yeah, Lindsay, you have a question?
No, I was just thinking, I think for me, and it's funny, I asked that question about shamatha and I realized, like, as I was practicing, I think I'd forgotten shamatha in my practice completely. Like, I think my daily practice is like all Vipassana without any of that rest of like just like settling, just going straight into that, like trying to, awareness of, what is seen and all of that. And it was really quite actually like interesting for me to really sit in that shamatha phase and take it very consciously, wait for a little and rest there was a kind of self-kindness to myself in a way, is how it really felt like, oh right, like this is really what it's about too. And then I'm remembering too, like shamatha and vipassana are like completely related, right? Just as you were kind of just saying. And I was just wondering if you could speak a little more to that.
About like how they're kind of dovetailed together, the two practices. Yeah. So you know, in a lot of the commentaries, they suggest that vipassana and shamatha are not practices themselves so much as Buddha is attempting to cultivate qualities of mind. You know, the insightful quality of mind and the calm, abiding quality of mind. So it's like, to your point, Lindsay, it's like if we just go straight into just kind of dry observation, this open awareness of everything, it's like our sensory clarity gets really high, and it's like I'm noticing, and it's just like, wow, the sensory information can start to build up, and it can start to feel frenetic or overwhelming, sensory overwhelm. So by bringing in the okay, I'm touching that. Sometimes I like to talk about it as being a two-handed practice. First hand, oh, I'm contacting that. The second hand, what am I bringing to it? Can I bring that equanimity piece to it? And that allows like a kind of like a non-reactivity. You know, that brings that shamatha response in that way. So something can arise, and then that equanimity kind of like brings the cooling effect to it. Now then, going back to originally, you know, the analysis and synthesis, the synthesis piece talking about conditionality, dependent co-origination. We'll get into that, the 12 links of dependent origination in an upcoming class. And I know probably a lot of people here have studied it already, but you know, that whole process talks about how the self is constantly triggered into arising. So sometimes, well, you know, very often that's just an unconscious process. So like what was discussed before, like, you know, I wake up and I'm automatically in a fight or flight experience. There's this kind of me versus the world that happens. And how in Beth Jacobs' definition of Citta, it's this process that kind of stitches together this continuity of experience. But I like to say how, you know, we all have kind of like a handful of like sub egos, you know, that all are inside of us. It's kind of like a committee sitting at the table, and they all kind of get a spotlight. It's like we all kind of have, you know, a dissociative personality disorder to some degree. You know, we have a committee of selves. And we like to think that the calm, cool, collected, rational self is in charge all the time, but like there's all these reactive patterns of here's my anxious self, here's my resentful self, no, here's my longing self, you know, that's constantly changing of the guard that happens. But we're not aware of how I'm responding to one that's creating the conditions for the next. And then they do the changing of the guard, then the other one takes place. So really, when we're able to create this increased sensory clarity and capacity to discern what our subjective experience is, we can notice, oh, this is arising. But the degree to which we're able to really bring that strong equanimity response, it can not necessarily neutralize, but equanimize it to it's like, well, maybe that doesn't have to come into being. And it's like maybe that particular ego structure or sub ego self doesn't get triggered, so to speak. So there's this non-arising that occurs. And that's when we start to talk about kind of like abiding in a no self. There's no ego structure that needs to take over. So we all touched upon that to one degree or another, most likely, maybe some of us for a fraction of a second, for maybe some of us for a bit of time, where there's no real personality view that comes up at all. We're just kind of hanging out in the sensory system, being okay with it. Now, then the question is, how long can we kind of prolong that experience of non-selfing? You know, so then we get into like Buddhist concepts of the realm of the deathless and non-origination and such. So, but going back to what you're talking about, that's the dovetailing of the Vipassana and Shamatha, of the noticing on this very, very subtle level and being able to equanimize our experiences so we don't have these like unconscious reactivity of craving, aversion, unconscious that arise. And yeah, so, you know, that's great that it sounds like you've got a lot of practice and momentum under your belt of the open observation and Vipassana side. So I like that you said that when you touched upon the shamatha, you're like, wow, this is kind of like a self-kindness, like a self-compassion exercise too. So there's something about that soothing effect that I think is very important. And especially when I think next week I'll talk a little bit more of clinical applications of kind of a deep self-regulation capacity.
Michael, maybe you just touched on it and you'll talk about it next week, but getting back to Jennifer's question, like as a clinician who's Buddhist informed, is that depending on her, I guess, experience with meditation, would you having her spend more time on one than the other to help her with the, like, I mean, sure, maybe you're getting into this later, but what of these four versions or parts of the meditation, you know, do you focus on? Is it always all of them? Is it sometimes more one than the other?
That's an excellent question, Eric. And yeah, I'll get into it a little bit more next week. But and maybe I was kind of saying this indirectly, but let's say if like you're working with a client and they're reporting having like a increased elevated baseline of anxiety, and they're open to and willing to do some mindfulness practice in session or on their own independently, ideally both together. I would try out with them how they respond to shamatha, how they respond to metta, and then see like how they respond to it, and whatever quality or aspect of it works, then like that's the beaver getting the first stick to stand upright in the river. And then it's like, all right, let's see if we can strengthen that, and then we can start to build off of that. So for sure, that idea of what I was saying, the training is like, all right, let's build that practice, and then what's happening is the gray matter, we're building the neurocorrelates of deep self-regulation for sure, or deep self-compassion for sure.
Sure. And if the client is maybe quite experienced, you then might have them spend just the whole time in shamatha or something. Is that possible too?
Sure. I mean, if they're deeply experienced, then we can get very exploratory and creative in what we can do. But I mean, if they have that ability to just cultivate shamatha and abide in it, then yeah, the more time that we can kind of spend in it, then that really promotes the state to trait mindfulness, where that trait becomes more available at baseline. And then, all right, can we abide in shamatha when we open the eyes, wash the dishes, brush our teeth, the activities during the day that don't require a lot of mental real estate? And then how is it that we can continue it on as we increase the tolerance threshold of more complex activities to I'm hanging out and I'm in front of the boardroom and I'm giving a presentation and I'm getting a lot of kind of confrontational feedback from people, and there's still, shamatha can still be available.
Thank you.
Cool. All right. Thank you, everybody. I love the discussion, and next week I promise I will say less on the front end so we can have more discussion on the back end. Thank you, everybody. So please go to the Google Classroom, and you can contact the links to the YouTube video. I'll be putting this up, and then follow along with the meditations, and you can build them up. I'll probably stay on for a couple of minutes afterwards. If anybody has more questions about accessing the Google Classroom, a couple of people have texted privately about that. So if you guys have a couple minutes, we can hopefully clarify some of that. A moment of Dana. I know some of you have been able to come into class and donate generously, and we really appreciate that. 2020 has been a hell of a ride, and it's still not over, but it is really increasing a globally felt economic insecurity, and inside LA is very much subject to that as well. So your generosity will definitely make it so that we can continue to provide these courses for people. And of course, conversely, nobody will ever be turned away for a lack of funds. I personally find that very important to uphold that traditional Buddhist standpoint. The Dharma is free and available to everybody. Okay, Frederick the Possum is sneaking back for round 2. All right, let's do a little dedication of merit. By the merits of these acts and other such virtues, may we attain a liberation for the benefit of all beings. We bow before those who come before us on the path, and to those who come after us on the path. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody. Have yourselves a wonderful week.
you.
Hope to see you all next week. Take care.
Did you need emails for something?
Oh,